And Anthony Dillon is with us, an Aboriginal man who is opposed to the voice. You've argued strongly against it. Sean Gordon strongly for it. But that division in the Indigenous community has been quite a powerful one, with Jacinta Price, the most prominent no campaigner. Explain to our viewers why you landed on the position you did as against this.
Okay, because what we're seeing today with the voice is actually, it's a similar thing to what I was talking about 25 years ago, this assumption that Indigenous Australians are fundamentally different to non-Indigenous Australians and that they have different needs. They don't. Certainly those needs may be met differently to varying degrees, but we all have the same fundamental needs. And I do oppose, this, when we say, oh, we spoke to the Aboriginal people. Well, which Aboriginal people? We're not all one homogenous group. And I think that's been, to see them as one homogenous group has been to the detriment of Indigenous wellbeing over many years. So my reason for voting no is I do not see them as one group. They're individuals. They have different likes, different dislikes, that sort of thing. And this voice seems to make this assumption, you have an Indigenous person, therefore you can only have Indigenous people who look after them and make decisions for them.
Anthony, you and I have talked about this for years and throughout the campaign, but I don't, for the life of me, don't see how the voice presumes a homogenous view from Indigenous people. I mean, we elect people to Parliament. We don't expect them to all have the same point of view. And we certainly don't expect Indigenous people to either have the same points of view or the same life experiences and issues.
Sure.
And Kieran, I'd like to respond with my position as to why I'm voting yes.
Well, let's just hear Anthony first. Yep.
Sure, Chris. But certainly in the discussion about the voice and around this table tonight, we hear about the Aboriginal people have told us. Okay? Well, which Aboriginal people? So we need to make that distinction.
I voted yes today because I want my children to be proud of who they are as Wankamara and Barkindji people. I want my people recognised in the founding document of this country as the first peoples of this country. I want my people to have a greater say when laws, policies and programs are being made about us, because we've failed. We have absolutely failed. And it doesn't matter which government is being elected, we have failed to address Indigenous disparity. The most miserable report in this country, the Closing the Gap report that comes out every year, that says that we spend $34 billion in the name of Indigenous people, and yet we get this miserable report that tells us we can only shift 4 out of the 19 priority areas. That's a failure on all of us. That's not a failure on Labor. That's not a failure on Liberal, on Nationals, on Greens. That's a failure on us as a country, that we can't shift the dial to address Indigenous disparity, although we're throwing $34 billion at this annually. What this referendum has done, in my view, it's now put that conversation in the arms of the Australian people. If they don't start to step up and take responsibility to keep governments to account, because it's shifted from Indigenous people. We've tried to keep government to account on addressing disparity. We've tried to keep government to account on the expenditure that happens across our communities. We've been unable to do that because our 3% hasn't allowed us to leverage that position. But with if this comes down to a 50-50 vote in regards to this, or even if it's a 40-60 vote, you're talking about more than 8 million people have come out in support of yes. Those 8 million people and those people who have voted no now need to stand up and keep this government and the future governments to account in their failings when it comes to Indigenous people in this country.
Sure, I'll just say 2 things to that. Certainly, the government, the leaders have failed, but it's not just the government. It can also be local leaders on the ground, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So we can't just blame the government.
Don't disagree.
Sure, it's a bit like the doctor gives me a diet and it fails. Well, the doctor didn't fail, maybe I had a part to play as well. The other thing too is we keep hearing about the voice, and my message, I'll be asked to do interviews and write articles next week, and my message is going to be pretty much the same regardless of a yes or no vote. And by the way, I'm different to other people. I haven't said that it's going to fail. Our New Zealand correspondent said over there, anything could happen. Still anything could happen tonight. So, But my message will be the same, and that is more than just focusing on the voice, we need to focus on the messages coming out. And the messages for far too long, as I've been saying, have been that Indigenous people are vastly different to non-Indigenous people, and only Indigenous people can understand Indigenous people. And I'm not against Indigenous people working in Indigenous positions, but I think we need to just sort of broaden things a little bit, not just lock them into, you've got to have an Indigenous person to make a decision on this Indigenous group.
Can I just say, I'm the chair of the Commonwealth Bank's Indigenous Advisory Committee. I sit on the Commonwealth Bank CEO Advisory Committee. I'm on the Woolworths First Nations Board. I chair the Insurance Council of Australia's Indigenous Advisory Committee. I chair the Steadfast Indigenous Advisory Committee. I'm the chair of the National Nexus Centre for Place-Based Collaboration. These companies are now starting. You know, we've employed more Aboriginal people in those companies through an initiative, and again, a conservative initiative of reconciliation action.
Of practical reconciliation.
Of practical reconciliation. The Voice was about practical reconciliation, giving Indigenous people a say.
Yeah,
those companies have improved what it is they do for Indigenous people because they've sought advice from Indigenous people to make improvements to their programs, policies, products and services, as well as employing Indigenous people across their business units so that they get their products and services right.
The shortfall in this argument, Sean, isn't people like you with a voice. You just went through a litany of boards you're sitting on and the gap's only getting wider, right? You are at the inner sanctum. You have had the ear of government many, many times. We are mainly talking about the indices for remote Aboriginal people who do not have a voice, whose kids don't go to school. And a lot of this is partly a personal responsibility. Yes, we've put this conversation front and centre with the Australian people, but if an Aboriginal kid doesn't go to school and the bus turns up out the front and mother or father or auntie doesn't kick them out of their home and into the uniform and on that bus, they're not going to get a better educational outcome. Doesn't matter how much money Canberra throws at them. Let me finish, please.
When the education system is broken.
Sean, let me finish, please. And we also have a lot of issues inherent in those remote communities that are not based on skin colour. They're in part based on the remoteness and the geography that white fellas face in remote Aboriginal Australia, that people like me growing up in a tiny country town and your electorate face. So in part, some of those horrific statistics for Aboriginal women occur at the hands of Aboriginal men. So let's have an honest conversation about the nation and the taxpayer and our structures of government stepping up come tomorrow, but also Aboriginal people to take responsibility for their lives. And as Noel Pearson used to say, we as a country end the tyranny of low expectations. We do not accept in an Aboriginal community what we would not accept in Penrith or in Charleville or in Victoria.
Exactly the rationale for an Indigenous voice.
Exactly. And no one's committed to the responsibility agenda than I am. Empowered communities is a responsibility agenda and reform agenda, shifting responsibility away from government, who have been doing the work for far too long, to Indigenous people, back to Indigenous people to step into those spaces that the Indigenous people are responsible for. What we've also got to accept is not just blame Indigenous people while kids aren't going to school. We've also got to understand, is the education system broken? If it is broken, then we've got to make adjustment to the education system. Is the way in which government departments are engaging with Indigenous communities failing? If they're failing, then we've got to make adjustments to ensure that they're properly engaging. It can't just be the blame of Indigenous people for the failing.
I remember Tony Abbott gave Noel Pearson close to $50 million to lift the school attendances in the Cape York area. And the last stats I saw a month ago in relation to Arakoon, they were sub 60%. So it's no shortage of money, Sean. It's no shortage of money.
Sure.